Okay, we're going to take a look at a situation that often occurs by early 1814. The Lake Champlain front is often very quiet. That's because there's not very many forces there. At the beginning of the game, only the New York militia starts there, the Vermont militia, and two sloops, the Eagle and the Growler. And the British usually doesn't have a lot of forces south of Montreal. So that front often remains quiet. But by 1814, that picture usually changes. And what we have here is a situation that we often see in the game. Here we have a lot of the original forces that started 1812 south of Montreal, the 100th Regiment, the Caughnawagas, and the Voltigeurs, and the two schooners Chubb and Finch. But looming on the horizon, of course, are these large British reinforcements that come in. Now, if the British has planned ahead, as he should have moved Prevost back to Quebec to anticipate their arrival so he can bring them in more efficiently. Now, if people find the stacks a little too unwieldy to use, I find them not too bad. But if you do find them quite large, you can use these little division markers instead. Just merely put the stack to the side, replace it with a division marker here, and you can move this division marker instead of this stack, if people want to do that. Now I'm going to show you how the Lake Champlain front is still rather important. It looks like a sideshow, but in 1814 it can be quite important. And let's see a typical British move for 1814. Okay, in 1814, I'm almost tempted to sing that Johnny Horton song. By 1814, Prevost will want to get those forces into the game as quickly as possible. And by the play of a 2 card, which is what is required for Prevost, his first move is often just down to Montreal. That's as far as he can go, because it costs 3 to cross the St. Lawrence. So that burns up a card, and now he's in a central position to either threaten the south through New York or continue west down the St. Lawrence. Now the American player by this time, the army that's often on that front is Hampton's army, which actually appears in 1813. Now, by 1813, Hampton is either usually stayed at all when he's doing nothing, or sometimes he's moved up the Champlain Valley. The trouble is with Hampton, he's not a very good commander, and it takes a 3 card to get him going. So the American player has a tough time with Hampton on that front. So, if Prevost and the British forces do begin moving down the Champlain Valley, the Americans are going to want to counter that. So with the play of a 3 card, of course, Hampton has no trouble whipping himself up to Plattsburgh, like so. Now we've got the classic invasion strategy with 2 armies facing each other. Prevost at Montreal, Hampton at Plattsburgh. But Lake Champlain isn't to be ignored. It's small, but you can get into all kinds of trouble if you don't have control of it. So let's look at some British responses. Okay, a logical play is to play another 2 card to get Prevost moving, and then he can move this gigantic horde from Montreal across the St. Lawrence and down the Richelieu. So it would be 3, 4, 5 to Île-aux-Noix. That's burning up 2 cards, and you have this massive horde coming south. Okay, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use the division markers so we can actually see the armies spread out and see their strengths. Now, if we add up all the factors to Prevost's army and add up all the factors to Hampton's army, in the end, it's a big gigantic 1-to-1. Now, the British have an A-class unit, that's the Marines, which they could use as their lead, but Hampton also has the Dragoons, which he can use as his lead, so that cancels. Hampton is a 0 for leadership, and so is Prevost. So everything cancels there, and Plattsburgh happens to be a clear square. So the battle for Plattsburgh would boil down to a totally even battle. So if you're familiar with the combat results table, The battle could be a long, drawn-out affair with a bunch of exchanges, could result in the retreat of the defender or the retreat of the attacker. It's really iffy, and I'm assuming nobody plays a battle card. So, if the British take Plattsburgh, yeah, they'd get 4 points and Hampton would fall back to Port Kent. But what the British would be facing is kind of a Saratoga scenario in essence, because the Americans can trade space for time, keep falling back to Albany, and eventually the British are going to have to garrison all these things, and the Americans will get stronger as they retreat upon Albany, and the British will get weaker. So that's one classic form of invasion that ultimately may pay off if the British keep advancing and keep gaining points, because there's a lot of points along the Lake Champlain Valley here. If they capture, let's say, Plattsburgh, Port Kent, Ticonderoga, Lake George, let's say they made it as far as Fort Edward, that's what, 6, 7, 8, that's 10 points right there. And to say nothing of lake control. But let's look at some alternatives. Now, one thing Prevost could do is, prior to reaching Île-aux-Noix, he could split his force. Cut it in half, for example. Take a force under de Rottenburg and have it move down through Phillipsburg and Highgate, down this way, 2, 4, and down to Burlington. The Vermont militia is not going to be able to stop a large force. He'd capture Burlington, which is the American naval base, and the 2 schooners there would have to retreat to another lakeside town. So that's one alternative. By advancing down both sides of the lake, you cause the American to, well, Hampton would have to split his forces, break that down, and move some to the east side of the lake. So you'd have a whole campaign going on there on both sides of the lake. Say Hampton put some forces there and some here at Plattsburgh, like so. So you've got twin invasions down either side of the lake. But let me show you how important lake control can be in this particular scenario. Okay, I've corrected that. I'm going to show you how the use of a 3 card by the British could bring the American army to a lot of grief. Now, it would take a 3 card. I'm going to show why. I'm going to assume that the British have built the brig Lynette at Île-aux-Noix. Again, that would take another card. But let's see what they could do. By the play of this 3 card, they could activate the brig Lynette, and let's say take the Chubb, and then carry the 100th. It's a 3 card, therefore 3 units, 100th, sloop, and brig. They go out into the lake, drop off the Chubb, and continue on and land in the American rear at Ticonderoga. Now they're squarely on the American line of communications, and Hampton is now cut in half. Why? Because you can't trace through Ticonderoga. The 100th is large enough to garrison the town, and you can't trace to the 4 corners because the 82nd is in occupation. So Hampton's army is now halved and cut off. So that makes the proposition of Prevost then attacking Hampton a lot more desirable. Now granted, doing that kind of move takes a lot of cards. You would have had to build the Lynette, you would have had to move troops to the 4 corners, you'd have to move the troops onto the lake, and of course then move the attacking force against Hampton. But it does show you how the Lake Champlain front can be broken. This is quite a little dance around this lake. Now conversely, the Americans can do the same thing if the British aren't careful. Okay? For example, if the American had he'd need a 1 counter there. Let me just examine this for a second. Okay, by late 1814, the American would have these options open to him. And I say late 1814, that's because the Americans don't really get their fleet going till that time. They have available the Saratoga, Ticonderoga, Eagle, Preble, but more importantly, they have leader Macdonough, which is very important, naval leaders. So let's say it's late 1814, and we have Macdonough here at Whitehall, and he's constructed the corvette Saratoga, and he's got a small infantry force there, the 33rd Regiment. So, if it was the Americans' turn, they could activate Macdonough. It takes a 2 card to get him going. Okay, so you activate Macdonough. He then picks up the 33rd Regiment, sails to the lake control box, dropping off, let's say, the Eagle, and he can sail right up here to St. Jean in the British rear and cut the British off. And now these British forces are cut off from supply because they can trace to Philipsburg but can't go through St. Jean. So again, you see the importance of lake control. It isn't all for the British either. Americans can seize lake control of Lake Champlain and cause the British a lot of grief. So in other words, if you are British and you are continuing south, you're going to want to garrison these rear areas to prevent such a move. Something like that. Keep your rear protected as you advance south, or you'll end up with kind of a Johnny Burgoyne scenario with you being cut off from Canada. So the Lake Champlain front, though very small, is very critical, and Lake Champlain is not to be ignored. It is quite important. Okay, I wanted to show a couple of tips about naval battles because they can be quite important, especially on Lake Ontario. Now, on Lake Ontario, historically, it turned into a kind of a naval arms race where each side tried to outbuild the other. So I'm just going to show a scenario here by late 1814, a typical one, and show you how naval combat works. Now, on Lake Ontario, or any of the lakes for that matter, if you have an equal number of ships on each side, that's the first modifier you should be watching for. So if you've got an equal number of ships, the modifiers negate each other. Now on Lake Ontario, Chauncey and Yale both cancel each other. So that leaves it at 0. And if each side has an A-class vessel, that also cancels. And by 1814, if each of you have frigates, that also cancels. So here's a scenario where the fleets are exactly equal. And if we look at the naval combat results table, if there are no modifiers, there's no disaster that can happen. Okay, and by that I mean if both sides are exactly equal and there are no negative or positive modifiers, if the attacker rolls a 1, that's the worst thing that can happen, he would have to withdraw and take 2 step losses. Okay, not the end of the world. It's a defeat, but it's not critical. And if he rolled a 6, the defender would withdraw and he would have to lose 2 step losses. Now where the potential disaster comes in is if somebody, one side plays an inspired leadership card, which means he adds 1 to the die roll, or negative as the case may be. And if you roll a 1 or a 6, modified to a 7 or a 0, that's where disaster can occur. Because if you roll a 0, attacker strikes his flag, all ships are removed permanently. Decisive victory. And in the case of the defender, if you roll a 7, defender strikes his flag, all ships removed permanently. So, in a nutshell, if you're going to get into a naval battle, make sure you don't have any negative modifiers. As long as you're at 0, you're relatively safe. But if one guy, one side has a plus or a minus on the die, and if you roll the extreme die roll results, you can lose your whole fleet. And in this game, if you were to lose your whole fleet, for example, if the Americans were totally destroyed here on Lake Ontario, that would be a disaster. An absolute disaster, especially late in the war. So naval combat, watch your modifiers very carefully. Don't go into a battle if you have a +1 or a -1 unless you're willing to take the risk. So that's my hints for the game Mr. Madison's War. I hope you enjoyed these videos.